Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show how I did this drawing of a Sphynx cat in Graphite. Now in this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to draw skin in Graphite, but before we get to that I like to start with the eyes. Now the eyes of this cat were actually fairly large, so this enabled me to capture lots of tiny shading and variations in those values to enhance the level of realism. Now in this situation there wasn't a great deal of detail in the eye itself, it was definitely more about the shading. But before I can do that I want to make sure that I've got the shape and size of the eye accurate. So to begin with I just use a HB pencil, I map in my outside eyelid area so I've got that right, and then I can start mapping in the pupil. Now when mapping in the pupil it's not necessarily going to be circular. Sometimes depending on the lighting the pupils are going to be quite narrow, so we do want to assess this for each individual reference photo. Now the one thing that you'll notice here is that I'm not jumping to my darkest, softest pencils first. I'm building up my darker shades in stages and working with a very gradual layering process. Now this is my preference. I do find that I'm able to capture more depth by working this way. It makes sure then that we can capture a wide variety of shades, but it's not necessarily just with the pencils themselves. Now I love using graphite powder in all of my graphite drawings. I feel that it really does help to create that initial softness, which can make such a difference when working with realism. Now for my base layer foundation, again I use my graphite powder. You can use your graphite pencils, but you will need to allow significantly longer for that base foundation to be established. Now if you are working with graphite pencils for this, you do want to allow as well for more blending techniques of each individual layer, because otherwise the pencils are likely to create a little bit more harshness than you would get using this method. Now when using this method of graphite powder, you can either apply it with a paper blending stump as I am here, or you can use an eye makeup applicator, a larger soft tool, whichever is your preference depending on the effect and even down to the technique that you want to use. Now the reason I'm using the paper blending stump here is just because it is still a small area. This is a smaller size stump, so I'm able to then get a bit more accuracy at this base layer foundation. And as at this point I start to work with my graphite pencils, I will then go back in with my blending tools to make sure that again all of my layers are soft. Now for this specific reference photo there was no detail in the iris, it was more about the shading as I've mentioned at the beginning of this video. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we're always having to apply graphite for that shading. It may mean that we need to add in some highlights, but they also need to be softer, almost give the impression that that shading was done at a lighter layer previously. Now my preference for that is to use a putty eraser. I feel that that gives me a lot more softness for this kind of technique. However, when I want to create more brighter highlights, like these little reflections in the eye itself, then I'm going to either use my Tombow mono eraser or my battery eraser. Now even the darkest layer of graphite, you can use your battery eraser very effectively for pulling in those lightest highlights. Now if ever you've got a really bright highlight in the eye, such as this here that I'm currently working on, then I would recommend to leave the white of the paper visible. This means then that you've got that highlight as bright as it can possibly be, and you can always then darken it later on if needed. Now there are many times where I've allowed that white of the paper visible and I've not really captured the right shape. This again is another example of where we can just go back in with our graphite pencils and adjust that however much is required. But as long as we have left the white of the paper there, we then know that that contrast in that area is as good as it can possibly be. Now contrast isn't just of course about the highlights, it is also about getting those shadows nice and dark. Now as I progress through this video I'm going to explain that further. Okay, so on to the next part of the portrait and drawing the skin. Now at this stage I want to be focusing on softness. I don't want any harsh edges at my base layer stage at all. And again this is why graphite powder is my preference. Now drawing anything that looks complex, regardless of what it is, I want to be breaking this up into small sections and individual layers. Now if you are an artist who likes to draw one whole layer at a time, then of course if that works for you there is no reason to change. But if you do feel like you're getting overwhelmed, you feel stressed with looking at that reference photo, not knowing where to start, then breaking that up into small sections can certainly help with that. Now initially I'm focusing on the shapes that I see. How is the curve of the eyelid? How should there be the shading on the bridge of the nose to the eye socket? Where roughly the eyebrow placement may be, how it starts to curve over onto the top of the skull. These are all the questions that I'm asking myself because the placement of the highlights and shadows is providing all of that information. Now the placement of the highlights and shadows are not random. They do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So for example, as I continue with building up my darker shades of graphite powder, I'm focusing here on where is the shadow around the eye, because that will help to show where the eye socket is. Here on the bottom, that's going to give more formation to the cheek. The way that it curves up and getting this angle right here is crucial for the jawline. So if I can get this accurate right at my base layer stage, then the drawing is more likely to be accurate as I continue to build my details. Now as I continue here with my graphite pencils, I'm going to really start to work more on the refinement of where those shadows and highlights are. Now at this stage, the way that we're using the pencil is crucial. How we're holding the pencil, how we're moving the pencil, and the amount of pressure that we're using, even the point of that pencil, all make a difference. Now this is something that I do explain thoroughly in the real-time step-by-step versions of these lessons. I cover everything in the moment with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so if they are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. Now another key aspect of my drawing process when working with graphite is the erasers that I like to use. Now this is something that I've briefly mentioned when working on the eyes, but here the putty eraser is usually my go-to when drawing skin, especially for mapping in those highlights early on. It's a bit easier to get softness with those highlights rather than using a more firm eraser such as a Tombow mono eraser. Now I will use that later on in the drawing process, but that's going to be for a different effect, which of course I will show when we get to that. But at the moment here, this is all about reinforcing my contrast and the softness. Both of those aspects of the drawing process here for this specific effect is really important. Now moving on to the rest of the face. Now this is where it could potentially become quite confusing with the creases, the small little folds in the skin. Now the way that I'm going to break this up is first of all just focusing again on the shapes that I see. Now when working smaller, we may not have room to add all of these wrinkles, but we can certainly add enough to still make it look realistic. Now this is my preferred method, my preferred approach when drawing anything like this. So the boxer wrinkles, pug, anything like that with a shorter nose where they do have more of these creases, this would be the way that I would simplify that. Now again, once I've got my main shapes in place, it's the base layer that I want to focus on. So still making sure here that I've got no harsh edges. Now this can actually be something that happens more easily with these kinds of folds in the skin. Because of how we naturally see the shadows, we focus more on those darker values and then forget the softness either side. So once I've started to build up these values in stages, once I'm happy with my base layer, I still want to make sure that I don't create any harsh pencil strokes with really dark pencils. Now that's why here I'll start off with my HB pencil first to again establish the shape of that correctly, and then I can consider those darker values. Now by working with this more simplified approach, it just means then that I'm taking that pressure off myself, that I'm not going to go with a pencil that's too dark too soon. It sometimes makes us feel like we are more committed than we need to be. Here at times it might actually look like I'm losing some of those folds and wrinkles, when in actual fact the softness here is going to help with the expression, the shape and form, and the depth. So sticking with that softness, you can see here that I've continued to build up my darker values, and now I need to reinforce my highlights. So to make sure that I'm doing that, I'm using the putty eraser, and I'm making sure here that my highlights aren't too bright. Now regarding that, this is going to again change that shape and form like I mentioned at the beginning of this video. I don't want to have any overly bright highlights because then they're not going to look as bright in the eyes. So making sure that I've got my range of values here, highlights, midtones and shadows, is something that also contributes massively to the amount of realism. Not all highlights need to be bright white. Now here, this is of course where I'm now starting to use a different eraser. This is my Tombow mono eraser. Now I'm trying to make more of the highlights visible, and I'm also building in some sections of that texture on the skin. It's not necessarily all entirely smooth. Now when I'm working with this kind of texture, getting the balance right is important in terms of not removing too much graphite. If you're working larger, you'll have more freedom with this, but smaller areas, we're more likely to then use the erasers too much and then remove the layers underneath. The drawing then ends up looking too light, and then we go backwards on our contrast. So making sure not to overdo the erasers is also really important. Now areas around the nose and the mouth, especially on a portrait like this of this size, it's only a 6 by 8 inch, so I do need to be realistic here with what I can include. But as long as I focus on my main highlights and shadows, the rest of the portrait in this area will still look realistic, as long as I've got those placements right and the range of values. Now here, if I was to overdo this smaller area would just get completely sort of flattened with graphite. I'd end up then becoming more two-dimensional with the drawing. So if I only have space to add 2 or 3 main groups of shadows and highlights, but I can actually see 6 or 7 in the reference photo, then I'll only go with the main ones, because that's more important than trying to fit all of them in and then lifting up too much graphite, going back to what I've just mentioned. Now on to the next part of this portrait, and that is the ears. Now this is where again I'm going to use my graphite powder to speed up this initial base process. But the important thing to remember about that is I prefer this effect with this method of graphite. I'm not using this just to make the drawing process faster. The fact that it is faster is just a bonus. Now when I'm working with drawing something that's out of focus, I really want to make sure that I'm not having any harsh edges and that I've kept my ranges of graphite very blended. There shouldn't be any harsh start and stop points. Now as I progress through here and I start working on the inner ear, I'm going to be working with quite dark graphite powder and building this up, but making sure that the edges, as it fades into something that's lighter, has always got a real degree of softness. Now if my edges are too harsh, I'm going to then make that section of the drawing look more in focus. That's going to pull it a little bit closer to the camera, and I'm not going to have the effect that the reference photo has captured. So again, this is where I'm going to be relying a lot more on my softening techniques rather than using the pencils for refinement and detail. Now at this stage, when I do start to use my graphite pencils, I'm basically just tidying up those values and making them a little bit darker. The softness has all been achieved here with the graphite powder, but I needed to have some of these values a little bit darker in order to get my contrast right. Now graphite powder will only go so dark, so when you do have a particularly dark shadow, it will have to have layers of graphite over the top, but we still want to be building those up in stages, one layer at a time. Now one thing that is also really important about drawing realism is to notice any changes in the light source. Now if you've got more of a one-sided light source, there's going to be shadows that are darker on one side and highlights that are going to be brighter on the other side. Now the lighting here, there was slightly more of a one-sided light source, but it was quite subtle. The right side of the face is a little bit darker. You can see that from the photo in the corner of the finished drawing. The ear on this side was also a little bit darker, but in some cases it might be a lot more obvious. One eye might be significantly darker, there might be a very strong shadow. And in order to capture more of that depth, the shape and form, it's really important to notice the differences from one side of the face to the other. Now the chin when drawing domestic cats are usually quite a bit smaller than big cats, so we do want to be making sure here that again we're not forcing too much detail in a tiny area. I want to just focus more on those main sets of values, and if I can only add in a handful of little details, that's going to be my preference rather than trying to draw all of them. Now as I start to work on the body, the last part of this portrait, I want to again focus on softness. This was also out of focus, so making sure that there are no harsh edges and softness at each layer is really important. Now if there are reference photos like this where the body is off to one side, I usually don't like to work from those. Of course there are exceptions to the rule, but sometimes it can actually pull focus away from the centre of the portrait, especially if it's a face-on portrait like this. However, there are things that we can do to help soften that. Now, one of the things that I've done here personally is on the right hand side, on the very top where the neck and the back would be, I've actually blurred that a little bit more and I've lightened it ever so slightly. Now, this is all explained in the real-time version of this tutorial and demonstrated exactly why I've chosen to do that. But I do just feel that if this area of the body on the right hand side was too harsh, too dark, that it's almost like a line that's been cut through the middle section of that side of the portrait. And as always, for something like this, my goal here is to keep that focus on the face, the eyes, being how big they are here. It's something here that's going to really keep that attention. I don't want anything there in the portrait that's going to pull that away. Now, this is, of course, personal preference. This isn't something that we have to do, but I did feel here that it was something that I feel would make my portrait a little bit better than the original reference photo. It's something minor that could actually have quite a big impact. The other thing as well is here, the top of the back was almost in line with the eyes. So if that was a little bit too harsh, being right in the centre of that portrait, that would again just draw that focus away. Now, if this was a pet portrait commission, then that is something that you could discuss with the owner prior to making those adjustments. Now, just like when working on the face, I want to be making sure here that I've given each layer the right amount of time. Now, the last part here, it's very easy to feel like it's not as important as the face. It's blurry, it's not got any detail, so therefore why does it matter? But we don't want to be doing anything here that's then going to bring down the realism, that depth of the portrait and all of the time that we've put in to the face so far. So I'm going to be working with the same approach, lots of layers, building up my layers in stages, and then enhancing that softness with each layer, but making sure I don't overblend. Now, overblending can happen quite easily when working with graphite powder and eye makeup applicators like what I'm using here. It's very tempting to do larger, more broader movements with the sponges, and then we end up creating a larger area of that shadow, which would then add more of an out of focus effect than we might actually want. So here, making sure that we don't do that and keeping the lights and darks where they should be, but still having softness on the edges, but not too blurry, is also going to help make this area have the correct definition. Now, the slight folds in the skin here on the neck, I want to be making sure that I've got that, but no harsh lines. If it's too blurry, then it's not going to look like the neck at all. So getting that balance right here, just like the face, is very, very important. Now, the last few minutes that I spend on a portrait is where I am adjusting those contrasts again, being the contrast is that full focus. So any areas where I need to brighten my highlights or darken some of my midtones or shadows, you can see here that it's a slight adjustment, but it's going to help to add more definition and shape to the face. Now, I don't want to be making changes here just for the sake of it, so it's always worth putting the drawing away for a day or two, coming back to it with fresh eyes, and then we can better judge what needs to be adjusted so that we know we're not actually just making changes just because we can. Now, normally the very last layer that I add is the whiskers. This breed didn't have any, so it wasn't something that I needed to incorporate here, but it is something where I want to be making sure all of the layers underneath are completely done before I add the whiskers, just so then that I don't have to work in between the whiskers, which takes significantly longer and far more fiddly to do. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload 2 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.